Hello, true believers. This is Doc Hogg, and welcome to episode 13 of Comics and Variety. Before I get started today, I'd just like to remind you that if you enjoy this video, please remember to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and like the video. And as always, if you wish to contact me, my email is dhog70@gmail.com, and my Twitter handle is @doc_hog. As promised in an earlier episode, today I'm going to look at Brie Larson's speech at the Crystal and Lucy Awards. Now, a number of you may be saying, oh God, you're going to beat this dead horse again, but trust me, you will like this, particularly because I show how Brie Larson is not just wrong, but very, very wrong. Now, this will be a fresh perspective because I will be bringing in the economist Thomas Sowell into this discussion. Now, if you know anything about Thomas Sowell, pitting him against Brie Larson in an intellectual manner is exactly like, well, this. Now, if you don't know much about Thomas Sowell, he is an economist who works at the Hoover Institution. He studied under George Stigler and Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago and is arguably the best economist to never win the Nobel Prize in Economics. In my opinion, he really should, especially for his economic analysis of intellectuals. He's had a number of good books dealing with intellectuals. By intellectuals, he means those who deal in ideas for a living. And that culminated about a decade ago in the book Intellectuals and Society, where he explains why intellectuals are different from most everyone else, and because of that difference, how they often inflict a lot of damage on a society. And while his analysis is spot on, it is not particularly a flattering portrait of intellectuals. And of course, who are the ones who promote the ideas that get Nobel Prizes? If you guessed intellectuals, well, good guess. And thus Sowell will really, highly doubtful that he will ever be winning a Nobel Prize. But today I'm not going to focus on his work on intellectuals. Rather, I want to focus on his latest book from last year called Discrimination and Disparities. And the reason for that is that it is particularly relevant to this portion of Brie Larson's speech.
I'd like to bring to light an aspect of our industry that has risen to the surface in the last week. It's an issue that's been bubbling since really the whole time, but this issue has a solution that each one of us in this room can participate in. So earlier this week, USC Annenberg's Inclusive Initiative released findings that 67% of the top critics reviewing the 100 highest grossing movies in 2017 were white males. Less than a quarter were white women, and less than 10% were unrepresented men. Only 2.5% of those top critics were women of color. So you're probably thinking right now, wow, that super doesn't represent the country that I live in, and that's because that's true. This is a huge disconnect from the US population breakdown of 30% white men, 30% white women, 20% men of color, and 20% women of color. So why does that matter? Why am I up here giving you statistics when I could be spending this time talking about my publicist?
And Thomas Sowell says... Now, what Thomas Sowell would actually say is that Brie Larson and the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative both suffer from what he calls the invincible fallacy, and that is the belief that outcomes in human endeavors would be equal or at least comparable or random if there were no biased interventions on the one hand nor genetic deficiencies on the other. Now, the second part of that, genetic deficiencies, Sowell doesn't spend much time discussing that part in his book. I think the reason is most of that is this idea that differences among races are due solely to genetics, and that some races are genetically inferior. That's largely limited to the political fringes these days. Although Sowell does note that in the early 20th century, this idea was very common among intellectuals. The idea of eugenics, and loads of prominent intellectuals were part of the eugenics movement. Everyone from George Bernard Shaw, Winston Churchill, Harold Lasky, John Maynard Keynes, you name it. They probably you name the intellectual, they probably believed in eugenics at that time. The far more common fallacy is the first one, biased interventions. In other words, discrimination, racism, sexism. Now, if we apply the invincible fallacy to what Brie Larson is saying, well, Brie Larson clearly thinks that if the U.S. population broken down by race and gender looks like this, then the breakdown of movie critics should look exactly the same. But clearly it doesn't if the Annenberg statistics are to be believed. And why is it that there is this disparity? Well, presumably, according to Brie Larson, it's due to some form of discrimination. In fact, we don't even have to say presumably. We can actually look at Brie Larson's remarks.
Am I saying that I hate white dudes? No, I'm not. But what I am saying is that if you make a movie that is a love letter to women of color, there is an insanely low chance a woman of color will have the chance to see your movie and review your movie. And this is also not to mention other people besides white dudes like Star Wars and would love the opportunity to do a set visit. And I'm also saying I don't hate white dudes. I'm just saying we need to be conscious of our bias and do our part to make sure that everyone is in the room. Our industry has gone through a major growth. We are expanding to make films that better reflect the people that buy movie tickets, but they are not allowed enough chances to read public discourse on these films by the people that these films were made for. I do not need a 40-year-old white dude to tell me what didn't work for him about A Wrinkle in Time. It wasn't made for him.
So men of color, women more broadly are being denied the opportunities to review films. Exactly who's doing that denying, who's discriminating. Yeah, it's not entirely clear based on her remarks, but presumably it's the movie studios or maybe newspapers that publish movie reviews. But regardless, the number of movie critics, the proportion of movie critics that are white men, men of color, women of color, and so forth, should be, according to Brie Larson, roughly proportionate to the U.S. population as a whole. And as Brie Larson says later in her speech, the way to fix this is to make sure that enough women, enough men and women of color are given the opportunities to review films. Now, Thomas Sowell would probably also say that it is highly unlikely discrimination is the culprit for the race and gender breakdown of movie critics. Yes, it's true that the race and gender breakdown of movie critics doesn't look anything like the U.S. population as a whole. And that is true for almost any sort of endeavor, whether it is an occupation, a sport, a hobby, etc. Of course, Larson might respond, well, that's because of discrimination, and we've never had a country or society that's free of discrimination. So, of course, you're going to see this, this lack of equality in all sorts of other areas of society. But Thomas Sowell would point out that discrimination is not a very good explanation for unequal outcomes. In fact, there are many groups that have great levels of success despite discrimination. The best example, but far from the only one, being the Chinese in Malaysia. The Chinese face not only social discrimination in Malaysia, but legal discrimination. For example, by law, the universities in Malaysia can only admit a limited percentage of Chinese each year. Nevertheless, the Chinese are on average more successful than other groups in Malaysia, at least when it is measured by income. So what accounts for these differences? Sowell argues that the main factor is culture, which he defines as, quote, specific skills, general work habits, saving propensities, and attitudes toward education and entrepreneurship. In short, what economists call human capital. In other words, basically a lot of the ideas that are bouncing around in our brains. And there are a lot of things that affect culture, and interestingly enough, one of the biggest ones is geography. That is, that where you grow up will have a big impact on where you end up. And to see this, the example I actually want to use here is the National Hockey League. Now, why hockey? Well, bear with me for a minute. First of all, the NHL has players from many different nations all over the world. From Larson's perspective, then, the NHL should be representative of the entire world. But is that the case? Well, by last count, there are about 493 players in the NHL, 27 of whom are black. That's less than 3%. Less than 3% of the players in the NHL are black. Africa alone, the population of Africa is about 14.5% of the world population. Now, obviously, not everyone in Africa has black skin. You take that into account, that would probably bring that percentage down. But on the other hand, it excludes excludes all other people who trace their lineage back to Africa and live elsewhere in the world, which of course you factor that in, that's going to bring that number up. In short, though, it's fair to say that the NHL is not very representative of the entire world, at least when it comes to the number of black players in the NHL. Now, why is that? Well, one explanation could be that blacks cannot play hockey. That is, that they don't have the athletic skills to play hockey. But that explanation, all you have to do is think about it for a few seconds to realize how ridiculous that is. You look at the other sports leagues, the National Basketball Association, National Football League, Major League Baseball, to see plenty of blacks who have tremendous amounts of athletic skill, and surely enough athletic skill, more than enough to do well in professional hockey. Now, you might also, another possible explanation is that maybe the owners of NHL teams are maybe they discriminate. Maybe they are racist toward blacks. Maybe they run racist organizations that want to avoid bringing blacks into the NHL. But here's the problem with that explanation. There are 6 owners of NHL teams who are also principal owners of another major sports team, a sports team in the NBA, NFL, or MLB. Take, for example, Ted Leonis here in Washington, D.C., very close to where I live. He owns both the NHL team, the Capitals, and the NBA team, the Wizards. All right. So for the racism explanation to work here, you would have to believe that NHL owners are racist when it comes to hockey, but not racist when it comes to other sports. And if that explanation doesn't make sense to you, well, good. It really shouldn't. So let's bring in the next and final explanation, geography. That is, where are most hockey players, where are they originally from? And over 70% of players in the NHL are from one of 3 regions in the world. About 4% come from Russia. Just over 24% come from Europe. And almost 44% come from Canada. Now, why is this? Well, I mean, these are places that are in the higher latitudes of the world. They tend to have longer and colder winters, which means that lakes and ponds freeze over, and they freeze over longer. And thus, kids in these areas are much more likely to grow up playing hockey. And it's, no surprise that professional hockey players tend to come from areas where they play a lot of hockey growing up. So, how many black people live in these three regions? Well, in fact, less than 1% of the population of Russia is black. About 2% of the population of Europe is black, and not even 4% of the population of Canada is black. So the main reason why there are so few blacks in the NHL is that there are just very few blacks living in the areas where you're likely to grow up playing a lot of hockey. So the fact that there are so few blacks in the NHL has nothing to do with genetics or discrimination and has everything to do with geography. And the news flash for Brie Larson and others like her is that these kinds of disparities, where a particular profession does not look like the society at large, that's the norm. So the fact that the top U.S. movie critics do not reflect the race and gender breakdown in the U.S., that is unremarkable. It's what you would expect. It is caused by a host of factors, and bias or discrimination are almost certainly not the cause. Very quickly, here are two other examples. The state of Florida has only about 6.5% of the U.S. population, but over 12% of the players in the NFL come from the Sunshine State. Jews are less than 1% of the world's population, but people with Jewish surnames have won 30% of the Nobel Prizes in science. Now, the reasons for that, well, Florida has a massive youth football program. The Jewish culture emphasizes education as a way to advance, and I'm sure there are other reasons. But the point basically being that these kinds of disparities are common. If human beings were random events, then you would expect only about 6.5% of players in the NFL to be from Florida. You would expect only 1% of Nobel Prizes would be won by Jews. But clearly that's not the case. And it won't be the case in most human activities, be they professions, sports, hobbies, or whatever. Now, to finish, here are the three lessons we should take from Thomas Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities. Number one, human beings are not random events. Two, because of that, disparities are common. The racial and gender makeup of most human activities will not reflect the makeup of the larger society. And three, there are many reasons why these disparities happen. Culture, geography, and so on. However, discrimination is seldom the cause. Okay, I'll provide links to my sources for all of this in the description below. No hogs headlines today, as this video has gone on long enough. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for your time, and have a very nice day.